There's no denying the fact that the right is a house divided. So you would have thought, after the election of President Donald Trump, we should have entered the golden era of the right, celebrating the fact the whole trans movement has been defeated, all these progressive ideas, all of this rhetoric, we finally defeated the beast. And we should have now be reigning and celebrating and be united in the ways that we've never been, And yet something completely different happens. Charlie Kirk gets assassinated. Now you have a house divided. These sort of two camps, you have the people like Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson on one end. And on the other end, you have the more traditional type of guys like Ben Shapiro, Andrew Klavan, Michael Knowles, all these guys from the Daily Wire, So you have these two camps, and then you have people like Megyn Kelly who trying to sort of, keep the peace. I remember even years ago thinking that this was going to happen, because here's the thing, no movement that is about we're right, they're wrong, any movement that sees the other side, the enemy, the left, right, as the enemy, and, sort of prides itself in self-righteousness, prides itself in superiority, is going to sustain, because in both camps, at the end of the day, we're both sinners. The trans people on the left, the people who are completely deluded, and the right, all of us are sinners. And that is something that I really appreciated about Charlie Kirk, that he was a different kind of conservative. Yes, he was in the world of politics. Yes, he was leading these debates. But at the end of the day, when you looked at Charlie Kirk's life and you truly looked into the things that really motivated him, he understood at the end of the day, politics are important because they do drive the course of human history. But ultimately, our solutions are not political in nature deep down, because at the end of the day, our problems are spiritual. And that is something that Charlie Kirk recognized. So when he was debating those college students on the campuses, he was not addressing them from this point of superiority, looking at himself. Yeah, I'm a conservative guy. I have all the answers. And look at you. You're wrong because you're stupid. No, the way that Charlie Kirk always tried to conduct himself was understanding that, this was a spiritual battle. We are sinners. They are sinners, and the only reason why, I have a correct view on things is because God revealed it to me, because God showed to me, that I am a sinner who's lost. And because Jesus came into my life, he transforms my life. I cannot engage with the other side from a sense of moral superiority or pride. I have to engage in a way to lead people to Christ.
If you're engaged in the creation of that content, I think God has a better plan for you. I know that might sound preachy and not what you want to hear, but just maybe you'll have an encounter with God, and Jesus loves all of you, and he can transform your life. He transformed my life. I've had a lot of problems in my life, and Jesus solves everything. And every day is a new day, and it's a hopeful, beautiful life ahead of you. And I know that might not be something you even believe, and you might think that all Christians hate you and your way of life and all those sorts of things.
Most of them do.
Well, I'll say this. I'm a pretty firm believing, outspoken Christian, and God loves every single one of us. We're all sinners, and Jesus died
you've
for
definitely
us.
been the most respectful one that I've seen.
Well, thank you. That's very, very kind. And I can tell you, it's not me. If it was me, I'd be yelling and screaming. It's the Holy Spirit. Jesus has gone to work on my life. And so God bless you guys. Thank you for a great discussion.
Charlie, to show that Christ is the ultimate answers. And the only reason why I do have these conservative views is because they are biblical. They're the views that Jesus would have highlighted, would have stood by. And so this is why I always looked at Charlie Kirk with this kind of different lens. I'm not saying he was perfect, but he was a different type of conservative as opposed to the guys on the Daily Wire, or as opposed to other conservative, commentators who would always bash the other side with the sense of moral superiority. And I knew if you do that, and here's the thing, what happened? President Trump got elected. There's no, leftists to beat down. They're kind of lost their presence. So what do? And this is when we have this emergence of the civil war within the MAGA movement, within the right. This should have been a moment where we should have been united the most, because, President Trump is elected, he upholds conservative values. It should be a smooth sail from now, and yet something completely different happens. And I do believe that the right MAGA movement has been infected by what I believe is selfish ambition. It is a house divided because there's people within the right conservative movement who are driven by selfish ambition. They care not about truth anymore. They care about being superior, making a lot of money. And here's the thing, there are people on the right that I personally would not stand with. I do not stand with the types like Candace Owens. I will not stand with the types like Nick Fuentes. I will not stand with the types like Carl Tarkerson. And there's reasons why. First, let's talk about Candace Owens. Why do I not stand as a conservative with Candace Owens? Because I do not respect what Candace Owens does. She does not provide real concrete evidence. Candace Owens, somebody said, she practices what they call, this intellectual striptease.
Candace is actually quite magnetic in the way she presents information, and she has a style, it's an intellectual striptease, because she never puts her cards out and goes, here's what I got. She goes, okay, well, I got something. Let me show you something. More to come tomorrow and more to come the day after that. It's a little deranged, but there's something magnetic about it, right? But look at the political effect and how pernicious it is. It's taking attention away from the actual, not just the bad guy, but these ideological bad actors that are embedded in our society. And it's basically telling everybody, look over here, it's the Jews, or it's Israel, or it's Mossad. No, you'd have to ask yourself, well, why would someone do that?
This idea of making a bold claim that she cannot give real concrete evidence for, because there is a demand. We're living in an era where people love the skeptical, the things that we don't know. There's a word, the word occult, right? Occult in Latin, translated from Latin, means hidden knowledge. People right now, there's a deep market, Gen Zs, there is a real market for this kind of thing. You can just start planting seeds of questioning in things. You don't have the real evidence to back up what you're saying, but you can make these bold claims. You can start putting seeds of questions around, a certain topic, a certain, event, and you will make a ton of money. You can, literally yap for an hour and a half on your podcast about something that you cannot prove, destroy people's reputations, and you're going to be paid because people love speculation. And the reason why Candace Owens has a #1 podcast is not because she's a truth seeker. She's not somebody who is after, because she has really robust, kind of journalism about her. No, it's because she's cracked the code. She's cracked the nut. If you can just speculate, and, say, I feel this type of way, I had a certain dream, you can just sort of plant seeds of doubt and speculation and skepticism, and chaos in people's ideas about things, the way that she completely profited off of Charlie Kirk's death, and just, now distracting people from the real killer, putting into question the organization that he's built, accusing Mikey McCoy, going from Israel to the feds. I mean, the things that she's done, her methodology is so wicked. There's no way that, I personally can agree with that, and I think that is so damaging. It's so misleading. It's so rooted in lies and manipulation and narcissism and gaslighting that it's awful. It is awful, because here's the thing. If you're somebody who seeks truth, I mean, you think about it, whenever the Bible tells us that Jesus, right, as Christians, let's say, there's a bold claim. The resurrection of Christ is a bold claim. The Bible tells us, Jesus rose from the dead, that, there was these witnesses that, and the apostles and the gospel writers, they write about this event. As a Christian, if you're a non-believer and I'm a Christian, I'm not just demanding you that you believe without evidence. No, I'm presenting you the case. Here are the gospel writers who wrote this within the next generation after Jesus' death, early document accounts. Here is the presentation when Apostle Paul talks about how Jesus appeared to the 500, we are appealing you to examine the evidence. We're not just telling you believe in Jesus because, Jesus is Lord. Even the Bible, the Gospels, they're making a claim. They say these are the things that we've witnessed. There's this argumentation. There's a case being made. So when you see people like Candace Owens who say, make a big bold claim, oh, the FBI killed Charlie Kirk, Israel killed Charlie Kirk. When she makes a bold claim like that, but she has no evidence, no concrete evidence for us as viewers to look at and examine for ourselves, that is literally at the root of manipulation. That is at the root of using the occult, hidden knowledge that you cannot prove. That's wicked. That is a wicked, wicked, wicked thing. And it's appealing, and people fall for this stuff. And that's why she has such a huge following. I feel like there is not much to be talked about Nick Fuentes. I mean, Nick Fuentes is just a chaotic individual. And people say he's just making bold claims. He doesn't really believe any of the things that he says about women. He doesn't really believe the things that he says about Black people. He doesn't really believe about these things, he's just an edgy guy. But here's the thing, guys. Ideas have consequences. You cannot just be out there saying things like that. Words carry weight. The Bible talks about the fact that the words that you use, especially if you claim to be a Christian. And I think what's actually fundamentally bothers me about these people like Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, in particular, is because they claim to be Christians, and yet they use words so unwisely and create chaos and destruction rather than to build up and truly be after truth, and that is what's so disheartening to me. Like, why have I become so political in these last, months after Charlie Kirk's death, is because you see that evil is rising. There's this new form of evil is within the right. There's a certain rhetoric that is rising and is dangerous because it's so laced with Christianity. And we're in so much need of discernment. And then there's Tucker Carlson too, who, making light of things like Sharia law. Like, since when do we make light of Sharia law? Like, take away all the anti-Semitism. Like, are you serious, Tucker Carlson? Somebody who really understood. I'll show you a clip here where Tucker Carlson's view were, a couple years ago, and then where they are now.
So a lot of Americans are concerned about Sharia law.
Sure.
And they're concerned about polls that show a strikingly large number of Muslims would like to see it supplant civil law in the countries in which they live.
Sharia law is bad, Seth. I don't know if you've heard that. It's bad. It's worse than what's happening in New York and Detroit. It's just bad.
I don't know of a single Gulf country where it's illegal to proselytize on behalf of another religion. I think that in every Muslim majority country in the world, non-Muslims are treated, have fewer rights.
And you can tell when you go to a place like Abu Dhabi or Riyadh, like, oh man, I hope we don't ever wind up with a society like this with a rape rate of 0, where you leave your keys in your Lamborghini and don't ever worry about it being stolen.
So you often hear people say, well, Sharia is intolerant, women are treated badly, gays are treated badly. Women have, in the Quran, fewer rights than men do.
I'm not Muslim, I'm not for Sharia law. On the other hand, compared to what? Compared to Baltimore?
In England, it's 4 out of 10 British Muslims. In France, 29% of French Muslims would like to see it replace French law.
If people want to get wasted, they do it at home. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't.
Oh boy, I hope we don't wind up with that.
But I've seen a bunch of polls like this that show that the attitudes of faithful Muslims are not Western at all, and that they include a tolerance of violence you don't find among, say, Presbyterians or Jews.
Shut up. Sharia law.
Meanwhile, a California imam is apologizing after he referred to Jews as filth.
O Allah, liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque from the filth of the Jews. O Allah, count them one by one and annihilate them down to the very last one. Do not spare any of them.
Sorry, Sharia law.
And it's so weird because if you claim it to be a Christian, how is it that you can make a light of something like Sharia law? Islam is dangerous. Islam is antithetical to Christianity. It is the Islam jihadist extremists who are killing off Christians everywhere in the world. And it poses a real danger to the West, to Christianity. And why are you accusing, Israel and the Zionists and making all these things anti-Semitic claims? Israel never started the war, with Palestinians. Hamas attacked Israel. And rather than focusing on real events of the things that really happened, you see this change of rhetoric and you're wondering what is going on. Like, why is Tucker Carlson, entertaining the views of somebody like Nick Fuentes and trying to make them mainstream? And you feel this sort of need as a right conservative to draw the moral boundary. And I think that is something that Ben Shapiro very well voiced, whenever he drew that moral boundary with Tucker Carlson, because of the things that he's trying to associate us with, the rhetoric from, somebody like Nick Fuentes.
Tucker Carlson decided that it was important not only to host Fuentes, but to smooth over his views, water them down, and make them far more palatable to a normal audience. To understand just what Tucker did here, we must actually examine what Nick Fuentes says on his show. Nick Fuentes says women want to be
Women want to be but there's like a lot of women that really want a guy to beat the out of them.
Fuentes says that women are who shouldn't be in politics.
I will continue my crusade against women in politics. Have you ever stopped and considered, maybe if you get offended, there's such a strong emotional reaction, maybe that's one of the reasons why you shouldn't be making political decisions. I'm not attacking women. I'm attacking whores. I'm attacking sluts. Stupid, dirty bitch.
Fuentes says that Jim Crow was actually better for black people.
It's better for them too. Number one, but number two, who cares?
Fuentes says that white people are justified in being racist.
White people are every single bit justified in being racist, to the extent that that means going out of your way to avoid black people when you see them.
Nick Fuentes is a Hitler admirer and a Holocaust denier.
It is Heil Hitler Friday, Nick. Heil Hitler.
Hitler was a pedophile and kind of a pagan. It's like, well, he was also really cool.
When evil rises, you have to take a moral stance. And, evil rises in all kinds of forms and shapes. I feel like for the longest time, evil was so blatant in our faces. When you saw drag queens teaching little kids about gender affirming theories, it was such a obvious evil. But now you see that evil has become a little bit more sinister, a little bit more trickier and harder to, spot. And it's, it has this form of this anti-Semitism, rhetoric, has a form of this hatred for women. I hear a lot on this, especially among the Christian nationalists about oh, we need to take the women's right away to vote. Women do not belong in public spaces. Women are the problem. You see this kind of rhetoric, rising on the Christian nationalist front, and it's where is this going from? This is not even biblical. But, overall, you see that, the right conservative movement has become a house divided. It has been infiltrated by selfish ambition, people who are driven by their own pride and ego rather than being after the truth. And you see this conspiratory rise, there is this hunger. People love the conspiracy theories. These bold speculatory claims that are not backed out by evidence. The standard of journalism has plummeted so much, What it means to be a truth teller, a truth seeker is going after evidence. You find the evidence first and then you make the bold claim, not the other way around. So that is one tactic that you have to look at the people that you listen to. Do they make bold claims first and then have no evidence to prove? Or do they show you the evidence first and then they make their claim, they reveal their truth, And the people who do the opposite are liars. And they're deceivers. And they can claim themselves to be Christian all day long. They're not that. Okay. And that is something that is truly sad. And I see, this is dividing actually family members. This is dividing people. Here's the thing. I obviously have right conservative friends who support Candace Owens, who are okay with certain, rhetoric from Nick Fuentes within my own family. Okay. So I know how deceiving this is, but I do stand on my word with these things because there's just so much deception. But at the end of the day, I truly believe that there's nothing hidden that will not be made known. It is so important, for you to listen to. At the end of the day, the Bible calls us to examine the fruit of the people that we listen to, especially if they claim to be Christians, right? You ought to examine, even take away politics aside, when you hear Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, you hear them cussing and, cursing people, is that even Christian? Would a Christian speak in that way? Does a Christian, a truly born again Christian, speak in that way? You have to examine, how people speak, what motivates, what drives them, not just what they're presenting you, because there is a real war right now going on. There's this spiritual war that I feel is going on. There's definitely a push to distract us from the real evils. There are things that are really our country is in danger of. And the things that I see that we are in danger of socialism, socialist ideas being made popular when they're incredibly dangerous. I see the danger of Islam taking over, just has taken over in Europe, for instance. It's coming here, and it's already starting in New York, okay? And here's the thing. The enemy will always try to distract us with something different. It will be the Zionists, it will be the conspiracy theories about something else, and to distract us from what's really going on, and that is something for us to pay attention to. I don't think I would have been so political in these last couple months if these people who, so used to listen to did not make these bold claims, of being real Christians. Are you though? If these were purely secular people who just, said these things and made these things up, I don't think I would have, I would have still, probably talked about them, but what bothers me is just, there's just so much of using the Lord's name in vain. When you hear this, do not use the Lord's name in vain, is that do not misrepresent who Christ is. Even though I do believe that politics is not the answer, the reason why, Jesus never wanted to be a political figure, but he ended up affecting the politics of his surroundings. And that's the thing about being a Christian. You know, you can say, well, I don't care about politics. I don't care about politics. I don't want to talk about politics. But here's the thing. If you're going to be a truthful Christian, a real Christian, you know, you're going to affect your climate. You're going to have a stance about things. So there's no such thing as like being a Christian, but I don't care about politics. You know, Jesus said, do not be of the world, but Jesus put us into the, you know, and there are so many lies within the political world that affect our kids, that drives policy. And here's the thing, bad political policies and ideas have consequences. I mean, you know, communism, talk about persecution of Christians in Soviet Russia, right? That was a political policy that scarred a whole entire generation. So yes, you know, this idea that, yeah, we can, you know, I don't have to get political. I'm sorry. It will affect you whether you want to or not, you know? But here's the thing, you know, we have to always, at the end of the day, we always have to point to Christ. And that is something that I really respect about Charlie Kirk. And that is something that I always want to do, is that no matter what, we have to bring people to what does Jesus says, you know, what does Jesus call us to do? You know, like on all of these topics, you know, how would Jesus talk about the Jews? How would Jesus talk about the Muslims? You know, how would Jesus talk about socialism? You know, how would Jesus view, you know, all these Islam ideas? You know, like how would Jesus, you know, what would he be his stance? You know, on either side, on both sides, we're all are sinners. You know, like at the end of the day, the answer for the Muslim is Jesus. The answer for the right-wing nationalists is Jesus. The answer for the Jew is Jesus. Jesus is the answer to everything. And yet Jesus is the stumbling block to everything. And here's the thing. I'm not saying that the likes of like Ben Shapiro and Andrew Klavan, none of these guys are perfect. All of these people have their flaws. But I can tell, you know, Ben is not using and manipulating people. Ben is very much still, he'll present the evidence and let you make up your mind. Ben could have like made every show about, you know, about dragging Candace Owens through the dirt. Ben could have done that, but does Ben do that? No. Ben could have capitalized his money on Charlie Kirk's death the way Candace did, but has Ben done that? No. And so there are people who I still very much agree with. You know, I think people like Megyn Kelly are doing their best to try to sort of unite these, you know, both sides of the right. But, you know, there are certain things that you cannot stand by. Like, I cannot stand by somebody like Nick Fuentes who says these things about Black people, about women, even if he doesn't mean it. I can't stand with someone who just manipulates and lies and provides no real evidence like Candace Owens, you know? So unfortunately, we have to take a stance on things, you know? And so, all right, guys, I don't know, at the end of the day, you know, I hate to be so political about things, but you know what? Like I said, if these people did not claim to be Christians and followers of Jesus, I probably would have not, you know, made this video, but it seems like the time calls for it. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Let me know your thoughts on this matter, and I'll see you guys in the next video.